Residents got a final chance this week to weigh in on sweeping new rules aimed at protecting the state from flooding by using updated data on things like sea level rise and existing threats from climate change to determine where and how any future development should be built. But the rules have been a source of fierce pushback on both sides of the issue, and it doesn't appear the key groups involved are willing to budge. Our senior correspondent Brenda Flanagan covered the hearing and joins us now with the latest. Brenda, good to see you.
Hey, Bree. So DEP officials sort of offered a last-ditch open mic night for people to comment on recently revised rules aimed at protecting towns from destructive floods and sea level rise. These proposed rules include safe building standards, and they define flood risk zones that'll determine how high residents need to raise up their homes or where developers must plan for stronger flood resistance. But even after the DEP eased back on some proposals, they remain deeply controversial and opposed by many Jersey Shore mayors, builders, and business groups, including the NJBIA.
These rules are not a workable solution to our resiliency problems. There are still major flaws with this rule. It's going to have a major negative impact on our coastal and river towns. It's going to harm our urban redevelopment.
Now, maybe some of the hardest pushback comes against sea level rise forecasts in the revised rules. The DEP made some major changes, like lowering building elevation requirements from 5 feet down to 4 feet above FEMA's base flood levels. Scientists pointed to new data predicting oceans will rise more slowly than originally predicted. But 4 feet's still a big deal. It would put 40% of Cape May County underwater within 75 years, a consultant calculated.
These are not abstract numbers. They represent real land, real property, and real homes where people live and work and invest. The economic consequences of these restrictions cannot be overstated. Property values will decline as land becomes subject to new regulatory hurdles. Tax bases will shrink.
Beach Haven has quite a large historic district, and we still haven't heard a lot on how that's supposed to be dealt with because obviously, to raise all those old homes would be virtually impossible.
We still don't have a robust evaluation of the economic impact of the rule. And I say that because there's still no mention of exactly how many properties are set to be impacted by the new floodplain and how that will affect their value. Some studies suggest it can cause a 10% devaluation of a property.
As a homeowner, I realize that we have a huge problem. The water is rising. I look at it every day. So if people don't realize that because they don't live on the water, shame on them.
Now, that last speaker is Kelly Smetkowski, not a lobbyist or an official. She's a homeowner in Forked River. She lives right on Barnegat Bay. Her property's eroding, she says, despite an offshore barrier reef of baby oysters installed by the American Littoral Society. The whole area is under siege and losing its shoreline. We connected on a Zoom call after the DEP hearing, and she showed me her front yard. It's almost entirely all underwater.
This property went out 185 feet, probably in the 70s from this point. But in the past 10 to 15 years, they've probably lost 50 to 60 feet. I do think that builders and the towns, even though they want revenue and taxes, there should be areas that you just can't build on. If you know that the ground is eroding and you're losing property, they shouldn't be able to sell that property. That just should be it.
Now, Smetkowski admits she should have done more research about climate change before building there on the bay. She strongly supports the DEP's proposed rules, noting she's not an expert, but she's living with the issue. And several experts did endorse the DEP revised rules during Wednesday night's hearing.
The sound science that backs these regulations really is calling for us to become more resilient over time. So rather than waiting and passing the buck into the future and letting future generations deal with these impacts. What we are saying in these regulations is that we know these sea level rises are happening now.
But we're protecting residents. We're protecting businesses from the damage of flooding, from having to be put out of business, from having to be put, customers not being able to get there, people not being able to get to their jobs, and buildings destroyed and damaged, and people have lost their lives. And that's what resiliency means. That's what these rules mean. Taking steps.
But some environmentalists felt the DEP's made too many concessions to developers, especially a rule change that'd permit exemptions for developers building affordable housing in a flood zone. They asked the DEP to restore the stricter standards.
By lowering the standard, the state risks enabling development in areas that will face chronic flooding within the lifespan of infrastructure and housing projects. This is not precautionary planning. It is a gamble with public safety and taxpayer dollars.
Now, the DEP will continue taking written comments through September 19th. And Brianna, the DEP is hoping to formally adopt these rules by January 2026. At least that's the regulatory process.
Yeah, but that's not the only process, is it, Bren?
Oh, no, there's politics involved here, heavy politics. This is now one of the flashpoints in Jersey's governor's race. Republican Jack Ciattarelli's vowed the real rules would be, quote, DOA when I'm governor. Democrat Mikey Sherrill calls for a smart and responsible balance that protects coastal areas without hampering economic development, especially new housing. Republicans are saying it's the winner of the governor's race who should ultimately decide whether those rules should be adopted, Brianna. And of course, we're not going to know that until November.
Yeah, and then they'll have some time to get that under their belt. Brenda Flanagan for us. Brenda, great reporting as always. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks, Bri.